Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Josh Fector,
business editor Greg Jefferson,
investigative reporter Brian Chasnoff.
And it's our first podcast in 2 weeks. We didn't have one last week, and a lot has happened in that time. And we have a special guest who's going to try to help us make sense of everything that's going on in our world right now, and particularly in San Antonio. Second term District 8 Councilman Manny Peláez, thank you so much.
No, thank you for inviting me. Hi, guys.
Well, I think clearly the big story in the state of Texas since our last podcast was the mass shooting at an El Paso Walmart that resulted in 22 deaths, a killing that was perpetrated by a white nationalist who drove 10 hours to El Paso for the purpose of shooting and killing Mexican Americans. And this has obviously, shocked people throughout the country. And Manny, I know that you have this is particularly close to you because you spent part of your childhood there. You went to school there.
Yeah, I went to middle school and I went to high school in El Paso before I came to San Antonio to study here. And the tough part of it was having to text my friends, "Are you okay?" And then I didn't like that text, and then I had to text them, "Well, are you safe?" I didn't like that text either, so I had to delete it. And then, really the only solution was just to call and check on people and have that, and just pray that they answered the phone. But yeah, very, very scary and infuriating for a lot of us.
I can only imagine how people are feeling there. I mean, what kind of response did you get from the people you talked to?
Yeah, tears. Right now they're scared. They were scared to begin. Before this happened, right? There is a really, really nasty wind blowing through the United States that impacts Latinos on a very emotional and visceral level. They feel targeted because they are targeted, and quite literally that played out in the El Paso shooting. But this just sent the message to the entire community that they weren't imagining it, that this is for real.
Now, in response to this, you have set up, I guess it's going to be a series of 3 town hall meetings to discuss the issue of gun violence. The first one is going to be this week, this Wednesday. What are your goals for these town halls? What are you hoping that will be accomplished there?
From every single comment that I've heard, that I've got to read, I listen to the pundits, I listen to the experts. What's evident coming out from that is that people are hungry to talk about this, and that there is an appetite right now to have a very difficult conversation. Those conversations oftentimes play out online, in the comment section of articles, or they play out, between pundits screaming and yelling at each other, and nobody really ever talks to the community and lets the community speak to each other about it in a safe place with rules for dignity and respect on that occasion. But what I really hope to get out of the first one is to set the tone and really sort of define the problem and set out, all of the different reasons why something like this might be happening. And so we're going to be meeting this Wednesday at 6 p.m. at the Phil Hardberger Urban Ecology Center. And we're going to be having an expert in political rhetoric and its role in violence. And that expert is a fellow by the name of Bill Israel, who used to work with Karl Rove and wrote a very interesting book about, how Karl Rove's strategy ended up taking over, a national conversation and really coarsening dialogue, which was really, an interesting look. He teaches at St. Mary's. The other one is a rabbi from Temple Bethel, and then we're going to have a mental health expert to help us talk about the role of faith, sort of how to put this all in perspective, when we're talking about faith and community, and then our mental health expert to really address the mental health issues. That's the first one. The second one is going to be talking with law enforcement experts and people who are are experts in school shootings, workplace violence. And then the third one is going to be more of a policy discussion where the public and, council members and hopefully the mayor will join us and other folks will join us to talk about what's next. How do we really do more than just talk about this, but are there places where we can affect change?
Well, is there a role? I know this is something that we're in the process of exploring, but when you look at it would seem as though the city would have a limited role as far as what actions we could take. We're dealing with more with state and federal issues. I mean, is there anything that you could envision the city doing?
Sure. One of the things that we're really good at the city is making ourselves heard, and so never have we ever had a city council united, sending a very loud message to Washington and the state. Demanding action, right? So I'm blessed to be the new chairman of the Intergovernment Relations Committee, and one of the things we're going to be rolling out is a call to action to the state and federal government. I know the mayor is working on a unanimous city council resolution to do exactly that. But as opposed to just simply calling out in the media, imagine us using our government relations experts to actually go and really speak to the decision makers and agency decision makers and influencers up in D.C. and in Austin. We've always done that with regards to, grant applications and applications for, road funds and making sure that, certain ordinances are protected at, the state legislature. But we've never done it with regards to, mass shooting and gun violence.
Yeah, there seems to be a head of steam building behind background checks.
That's
I mean,
right.
at least you have Trump tweeting in favor of it. Who knows if that dissipates over the next few weeks?
Yeah.
And, who knows what Mitch McConnell is going to do in the Republican-led Senate. But does that go far enough? And, I mean, would you envision, sending San Antonio lobbyists
Yes.
to work background checks?
Yes.
Or do you want more?
Yes. The answer is yes. Everything. I mean,
Everything, yes.
pulling from every single lever available to us right now. Let's not forget, we live in Texas, right, where the state government has done everything it possibly can to take away from cities and from counties the ability to act on issues that may have something to do with gun violence, right? But there's nothing out there prohibiting us from, using our voice and our influence.
What about policing at the local level? Because that is something that the city controls and governs. Does there need to be a more robust look at security, the way police investigate potential threats?
Sure. Absolutely. The one problem that we've got and that the entire community agrees is that everybody would like to see more police officers, first of all, right? The increase in headcount is important. Number two, I think there's a general sense in the community that not enough coordination between law enforcement agencies really happens. There's a lot of talk about coordination. They pat themselves on the back whenever they have meetings with each other, but the public doesn't really feel like there's a
They've
coordinated
got that fusion
effort.
center, right?
They got the fusion center. So I think there needs to be, an opportunity for the public to understand exactly the extent of that coordination. And if there's opportunities for us to, collaborate more, then certainly, take that opportunity and run with it. And then the third thing is, mental health is something that Bill McManus has taken very seriously and trained up his officers on how to identify people who are in, mental health crisis, who are, about to quote unquote snap, right, or go postal, and that's really important. And I think doing that not just with a mental health crisis team is valuable, but training everybody on the police force to be able to look out for those kinds of things is vital. With an emphasis on the word vital, right? People die if we don't catch these things.
Well, something that comes out a lot in the reporting in the wake of these shootings is that, these shooters are often motivated by misogyny and have a history of domestic violence. You've been kind of advocating for boosted involvement by the city in preventing domestic violence. Kind of, how does this sort of take shape in that realm?
So the thing is, the one thing government is very good at is at creating silos. And not being able to break those silos down once we've created them. And so there is a silo. There's a pair of silos out there that exist between gun violence, right? And then there's another one that's just focused on mental health. And then there's another silo that's just looking at intimate partner violence. And, the reality is that those issues really in real life are not siloed. right? And so oftentimes the experts who are working on those things in parallel aren't even talking to each other. And so I think the first thing we need to do is have a difficult conversation with ourselves at City Hall about whether or not we've been doing it right, and if we're really just talking about three separate problems or one. Every single one of these shooters, every single one has, very similar red flags, right? Behavioral red flags and also personality type red flags, right? I mean, some of them are, they all seem to fit within a certain age range. They all have some triggering event in their background, bankruptcy, their wife left them, right? I mean, all of them have abuse or substance, physical abuse, child abuse in their background, and all of them have these ideations with, white supremacy or survivalist military mercenary lifestyles, and then they have a fascination with guns. And the really, really disturbing thing is that there's always a group of people around them who know that this is the guy who will eventually shoot somebody one day. That person always pops up in an interview saying, yeah, I always knew he was weird and I just never wanted to tell anybody. And so it's that also see something, say something kind of initiative that we need to take seriously.
One of the results that we saw from the mass shootings in El Paso and also Dayton, Ohio, which that happened on the same day, was we saw a tweet from San Antonio Congressman Joaquin Castro, because so many people, I think, have looked at the language from the manifesto that the El Paso shooter produced, and his use of the term invasion and invaders when referring to Mexican Americans, and some of the parallels there with the language from President Trump. And so Joaquin Castro put out a tweet last week taking a list of 44 people in the San Antonio business community. It was a list put together by an indivisible group. And he was basically calling them out for providing maximum donations to Donald Trump and expressing his disappointment with them. And it's been a very controversial tweet. My understanding is that there's been tremendous, Joaquin Castro's office has received, been bombarded with a lot of negative calls and response. And it's become a national story.
That's right.
What did you make of that?
I think that on one level, I'm still trying to figure out who that helped. It certainly didn't help elevate the conversation in San Antonio. I don't think it helped any of the donors see, some new way of thinking about things or doing things. I don't think it helped, the conversation about, mass shootings. And the one thing that I do think it accomplished is that it very, very quickly got, the two Castro brothers elevated into the, national, conversation. And they ended up with one tweet ending up, being spoken about by every single major news network and, including the president. He ended up tweeting, his some Twitter insult rage back to Joaquin.
Well, I think in classic Trump fashion, he said, "Joaquin, I don't know much about him. He's not the man that his brother is, and he's not much either," or something along those lines. Yeah, it was. He found a way to insult both of them.
Right, but he actually said, "I've never heard of the guy." Well, pal, you just did, right?
And of course, Don Jr. got them confused.
Right, but more importantly, in electoral politics at a national level, just getting mentioned in the news, having to do with controversy and picking a fight, that's gold. I mean, that was millions of dollars worth of earned media that Julian didn't have to pay for.
So both Castro brothers.
Oh, I love those guys.
Right. So, given what you know about him, would you say this tweet was that the intent of the tweet, to raise their profile nationally, to get him? I've never
come across. Having spoken to, I'm going to restart that statement. I have never walked away from an encounter with either of those two gentlemen thinking that every word they said or every one of their acts doesn't have a reason behind it. They are some of the most cerebral people I've ever met. And big frontal lobes, and these guys, are thinking 10 steps ahead of almost everybody. Yeah. I think that if you were just a very cynical political observer, the one thing that you could say is that those guys, in a matter of hours, managed to earn media worth millions of dollars as opposed to having to reach into their, advertising budget. I don't think they're dumb, and I certainly think that, they knew that that would be one of the results. I also don't doubt Joaquin's sincerity. I've been with him many, many times. Joaquin believes that there is a war, a coming, and aimed at Latinos. And Joaquin is, don't forget, one of the most important voices in D.C. when it comes to the, Hispanic Congressional Caucus. And Joaquin is a recognized Latino leader who stands up for that group. And if, as evidenced by all of the comments that, you go to, Joaquin's page and all that, and you'll see that there's a lot of people out there who really appreciate him having done that, right? And again, there's also a lot of people who, are really hacked off at him for having done it. And so I think Joaquin knew exactly what he was walking into, and he did it quite deliberately. And, the fact that the four of you guys are asking me questions about it is evidence of that. Right?
Well, and I think the thing too, to put it in context, is, I think a story had broken last week that the Trump campaign has, I think they put out something like 2,000 social media ads in the last few months using the term invaders or invasion, and so I think Joaquin Castro is coming at it from the angle of those of you who think you're just making a political contribution, as people, influential people have done throughout the ages. In this case, you're maybe funding something that you might not even realize.
Right.
And of course, calling out people in that way is a very controversial thing. I mean, my big objection to the way this thing has been covered is that people have said, well, he's put people in danger, their lives are being threatened. And I think, well, if a talk radio person criticizes the Express News, I don't think they're putting my life in danger. I mean, they have a right to criticize people. I think that it's certainly debatable whether this was a good strategy on his part, or whether it was fair to these business people. But I had a hard time seeing how simply saying I'm disappointed in you for doing this is is endangering the lives of people.
Yeah. So I think for those of you that haven't ever donated to a federal, a state, or a local campaign, you just don't write a check and then wish the candidate well. You actually have to fill out some paperwork and disclose your name, your address, your employer, your phone number, all that stuff. And if you're, especially the people who are maxing out in presidential races, they know that their name is going to end up on some very, easily searchable websites. And in fact, the four of you have actually gone on those websites and, searched for people. And so the argument that somehow, he's doxing, a lot, these donors simply by putting their name out, I don't buy that. I don't think he's doxing anybody. I think doxing is an abhorrent, practice. But I will remind everybody that, during the campaign, Donald Trump literally gave out Lindsey Graham's cell phone number to everybody. And so, his objections ring kind of hollow. But that isn't to say that, the folks who are on that list, are bigots and racists, and that they know that they're enabling this. I'll tell you, Greg Kowalski and, Phyllis Browning and Bill Greehey, anybody out there who would suggest that those three people are bigots has no idea what they're talking about, or they're trying to mislead you.
But at the same time, it's pretty rare for any San Antonio elected official to put any business leader on blast in any form. So I wonder kind of what you think about it from that perspective, and sort of, why is it that, on the whole, San Antonio politicians tend not to pick fights with the business community?
I think that the one thing everybody loves about San Antonio, and I'll tell you this just coming from a litigator's point of view, right? I've been practicing law for 20 years, is that we are all very polite to each other. And there is a certain civility in San Antonio when it comes to being in the same circles. You're going to bump into these people oftentimes. Nothing comes of putting people on blast and having very public airing of, dirty laundry and disputes. You'll see that in Houston and Dallas and Chicago and Detroit. That actually is a contact sport that people are experts in. But here that doesn't happen. And I also believe that, local politicians aren't going to go out and also call out their donors, which brings up something that I'm sure one of you was going to tell me, and that was, those people on that list also maxed out to Julian and Joaquin, right? And
That happens in the business community in San Antonio, like
Yeah.
you're saying. I mean, I've talked to a lot of real conservative Republicans who were in the business community here, and they've supported.
sure.
Some of them have given money to Julian's presidential campaign.
Sure, and supporting an incumbent, not a bad idea. If in fact you have some sort of dealings with government, and so just as a matter of practice, I will tell you that some of those people on that list, they have a huge budget set aside just to write a check to everybody and anybody who's in office at that one moment, because they either have federal contracts or they aspire to have federal contracts or state contracts, and we can all sit around and lament the role of money in politics, but welcome to the real world.
Moving toward back to the local issues, last week you all got the annual budget presentation, the proposed budget from City Manager Eric Walsh, $2.9 billion budget. And the city was dealing with some challenges this year. CPS energy revenues are short, or projected to be short about $14 million. The city is losing about $7.5 million in telecom fees. And one of the techniques that Eric Walsh employed in his proposed budget to try to help the city deal with this shortfall was to go to the representatives of SAWS and ask them if they would bump up their contribution. They give 2.7% of their gross revenue every year to the city. He asked if they could. I think the maximum that they're allowed to give is 5%, but he asked if they could go from 2.7% to 4%. And I was curious what your take is. I mean, there's some differing views on that. What do you make of it?
Sure. There's differing political views, and there's mathematics, right, that have to be done here. And so our budget is for the purpose of funding essential services. 2/3 of that $3 billion or $2.9 billion budget goes to police and fire services. So there's nobody out in San Antonio who says, you know what we need less of is police and fire, right? And so we have no choice but to fund about $2 billion worth for police and fire. The rest of it goes towards roads, streets, parks, airports, and pretty much everything else people take for granted, right, in living in one of the best cities in the United States. So come hell or high water, we need a budget that funds all those things, because hell or high water may actually come, right? And so one of those problems that we've got is that the state legislature made it very difficult for us to continue funding all those services, because their version of tax reform is to make sure that the cities can't raise the revenue that they need to raise. And they made it even more difficult when they decided to allow telecoms to use city right of way for free. And so there's $7 million out of the budget. And then we at City Hall made it even more difficult for ourselves by passing a homestead exemption. And so we still, knowing that we still had to provide essential services, where are we going to get the money but from SAWS, right? We can't go and tap CPS anymore because CPS is already maxed out on their rate. SAWS still has that extra room. And so I think Eric quite wisely went and looked at doing something difficult. The reason it's difficult, Gilbert, is because SAWS is not just sitting on a pile of money for nothing, right? That money is probably earmarked for something in the future, for infrastructure projects. And so if I were SAWS leadership, I'd already be talking about, maybe bumping up the next conversation that they need to have with the public about a rate increase in order to make up this $10 million loss. So the mayor, during our last goal-setting meeting, I don't know if you guys heard him, he said, listen, I like this idea of a homestead exemption, and don't worry about it because, it's just really going to be a tightening of our shoelaces as opposed to a tightening of our belt. Well, what we've just done is we've tightened the hell out of the belt of SAWS, so that we have the comfort of just tightening our shoelaces, which is okay, so long as everybody understands that there's a rate increase conversation coming very quickly.
Now, what about, you could make the argument that you're taking an action that can lead to a rate increase because council lacks the political courage to actually increase property tax rates. I mean, on the face of it, that looks like a fair assessment, is it not?
So I'm going to tell you something that politicians, politics 101, we're not supposed to say. So I'm going to break that rule. We are doing this because we lack the political courage to pass a tax increase. And we also lack the political courage to have told the public, hey, you know what? A homestead exemption that really amounts to an average of $28 for, savings for all of you. That's just dumb. Let's not do that, right? Instead, we came off these re-election campaigns, realized that the public was, demanding a homestead exemption. And so we gave them a homestead exemption that really amounted to nothing for the homeowner and put a, tens of millions of dollars size hole in our budget. And instead of going out and raising the tax rate, which we could easily do, the next worst and only option available to us is asking saws. Look, that's just the reality. And anybody who tries to dress it up as, to make it look prettier than that is not telling you the entire truth.
Well, would you have voted differently on the homestead exemption, knowing what you know now about the budget?
Absolutely. It was a mistake to vote for that homestead exemption. At the end of the day, the people who were wanting it saw it as, a meaningless gesture. The people that didn't want it and knew that all we were doing was, a little bit of theater there, are mad because now they know that we're having to scramble. And, we put ourselves in this situation. It was really just a bad idea in general.
Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about, and this relates to last week's council meeting, when you all were getting briefed on the budget, or I think just before that, there were protesters who showed up. I think people with Texas Organizing Project and Move Texas, they dropped a banner saying, what was it? I think, was it No Trust?
Yeah, I wasn't at my seat when I saw them unfurl this banner behind the mayor at the dais. I was actually in the audience talking to somebody, and I turned around and I saw it. And at first I thought it said no thrust, which confused the heck out of me because I was like, you know what? I agree. There's some of those people on city council, including myself sometimes, that, could use a little more thrust.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It said no trust.
So it's been one of my ongoing concerns about this council.
I know. All of you talk about it.
I think it's going to be the big issue in 2021, actually.
And it's like you kind of creep forward.
The thrust issue is going to be the one to, if Brockhouse runs again, I think he's going to. But of course, they were protesting because the paid sick leave ordinance, which the council passed a year ago and was set to go into effect on August 1st, got pushed back 4 months. It was an agreement between the city and business leaders who were challenging, legally challenging the paid sick leave ordinance. And so I'm curious to get your take on this thing because the city attorney Andy Segovia and city manager Eric Walsh seem to have worked out this agreement, in the face of legal challenges, all these questions. Let's just see if we can spend the next 4 months trying to work this out. And when that happened over that weekend, Mayor Nirenberg said, no, I want it to go into effect right now. I didn't really do anything to make that happen. Help us understand this, if you can.
First, there's a whole bunch of, it's a confluence of just unfortunate events that all came together at once. One, it's in July, right? Don't forget that everybody at City Hall, your elected officials, take a vacation in July. It's been 2 years since I've taken a vacation with my wife and kids. I decided to go to Nova Scotia, far, far away. And while I was gone, this exploded in everybody's face, right? The plaintiffs, group of local business leaders and business organizations, file a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality and, whether or not this thing could even be enforced in court. And they filed a request for a temporary injunction. A temporary injunction, for those of you who don't know, is a indefinite pause to whatever it is they're complaining about, in this case, the ordinance. So they were demanding that the ordinance not be enforced indefinitely during the pendency of this entire lawsuit. And lawsuits can take years. So instead of agreeing to that, the city attorney came to every city council person and the mayor and said, in all likelihood, we're going to lose. And we have some serious concerns about the enforcement and the constitutionality of this thing. The best option we see is to sit down with the plaintiffs and agree to a timeout, right? And, of 4 months only. And during those 4 months, let's make sure that this commission, this paid sick leave commission, works really hard to towards emerging with a product, an ordinance that will pass constitutional muster. And so what that did by entering into that agreement is it allowed that commission to continue existing, number one. And number two, it actually gave a very short horizon for that future temporary injunction hearing to happen, as opposed to drawing a random judge from our presiding court system to say, you know what, forever and ever, this thing's going to be in, temporarily enjoined until the Supreme Court decides. Nobody would want that. And so TOP and MOVE and some of these other organizations saw it as a capitulation to the plaintiffs, and when it really was just every one of us at City Council saying, look, if the idea is to stay faithful and to give life to this ordinance, and the only way to do that is to agree to a 4-month timeout, well, then let's make a difficult decision. I do think TOP and MOVE know exactly why we did what we did, and had we not done it and walked in there and gotten an indefinite cessation of the ability to enforce this thing, they would have lost their minds. And so no matter what, I think we were going to make those groups unhappy.
Do you think that there's a chance that, whatever the Paid Sick Leave Commission comes up with, that it can actually pass, constitutional muster?
So let's talk about the Constitution, first of all, so we all know what we're talking about. I'm not talking about the U.S. Constitution here. I'm talking about the Constitution nobody reads, which is the Texas Constitution. And all it says is a state or a county can't pass a law or a rule and enforce it if it runs up against and conflicts with a state law. And there's a state law in the Texas Labor Code that says, anything having to do with wages, how much money you earn in exchange for work, has to exclusively live within the jurisdiction of the state, and nobody else can mess with it, including cities and counties. That's just what it says, right? I wish it didn't. I wish it said, cities, you can do whatever you want, and paid sick leave, knock yourselves out and go do it, right? But it doesn't say that. And so the arguments I've been making, and I made them last year from the dais, were we're going to get sued. And when they sue us, they're going to say that this violates the Constitution and this violates the Labor Code. So let's be aware of that. And so to your question, will this commission come out with something that is, constitutionally defensible? Gosh, I hope so. Because if it doesn't, I'd hate to see all those good people's work go to waste.
So when the mayor said, "I want it to go into effect now," I mean, do you think he was being disingenuous, or what do you think of the?
No, I've talked to the mayor, and I'm not going to come onto this program and tell everybody that I think the mayor is disingenuous. What I will tell you though is that every single person, at City Council was briefed on this, and every single one of us agreed that the difficult pill that we had to swallow was having to, hit the pause button for 4 months on this. Everybody except for Roberto Trevino. He said, guns ablazing, let's go to the mattresses and see what happens.
So you're saying they all agreed to Andy Segovia's?
Everybody did.
Okay.
Everybody did. And because the argument was going out there, well, Andy Segovia is, going rogue, and Andy Segovia, is sabotaging the city. That guy is no dummy. He is really, really, really smart, and he's been practicing law in a longer time than I have. His resume would be on the street tomorrow if, he went out there and deliberately did something that the city council didn't want him to do. And so anybody out there who says that Andy Segovia went rogue has no idea what they're talking about.
He's kind of the opposite of a guerrilla fighter.
Yeah.
So
no, he's a very pragmatic man, and he's very careful.
Well, there's going to be a lot to come on that. I think on that note, we're gonna wrap things up. Councilman Manny Peláez,
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate you guys having me out. Keep up the good work.
And for those listening, we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.